Hello and welcome to Season 6, Episode 10 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading James Hitchcock's History of the Catholic Church, this time talking about Chapter 7 of that book, East and West, about the differences between the sort of Eastern Empire and the Western Empire for a little bit, and then getting up to the schism between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics. Which was really interesting. He kind of jumps around in time a whole bunch, kind of filling in on a whole bunch of stuff that he missed sort of in the earlier chapters that just fits better in this chapter. And he gets almost up to the present day at some points, which I thought was pretty wild with how he talks about sort of the branches of the Eastern Orthodox and stuff like that. So it's a really sort of wide spanning discussion here. Very interesting.
Yes.
You're in a good mood. You're in a good podcasting mood today.
I'm in a contemplative mood, I guess, but I'm not about other things, not this subject. So it should be great. Should be a big hit with our listener.
Yeah, I bet.
Although I'd really enjoyed this chapter. I especially liked that, like you alluded to at the end of the chapter, where he's talking about the other different Eastern churches, I guess you'd call them, but they're either are or are not in communion with the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, either before or now. I mean, that's why he said he got up to modern times. So, and yeah, it's pretty interesting. And I'm interested in the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Orthodox churches. I think it's a fascinating history, and they survive, and and it's really not that different.
Yeah.
Philosophically or even theologically than Roman Catholicism, and it seems like a lot of it, as we're going to see as we go through this, was originally like just political.
Yeah.
As far as but I mean, it seems to me some hyper technical.
Yeah, at some point.
Between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so what are we talking about today? We're talking about the Eastern Catholic Church and the Western Catholic Church, and how they kind of developed a little bit separately and mostly for political reasons.
Yeah.
And they had, different, because they ended up being parts of almost different empires, for a period of time. That's and of course they had different interests locally.
Yeah.
As we jumped into, like, well, Justinian, who was an emperor in Constantinople, and he rebuilt the great church of Hagia Sophia during his reign, which I guess was 482 5. Well, I guess, yeah. Let's see.
It's probably when he lived around 42 to
482 to 565. So I'm not sure what the years of his reign are, but somewhere in between those periods of time.
There you go.
Probably closer to the latter part.
I would imagine. They don't usually retire at early age.
If they do, it usually ends poorly for them. Anyway, so there's a discussion about the Persian threat, coming at that time, where the Persians conquered much of the Near East. They conquered Egypt. They besieged Constantinople itself, and but Emperor Heraclius, no, Heraclius,
Maybe.
Heraclius drove them off and in turn invaded Persia. Good for him. Recovering what was believed to be the true cross and personally carrying it on his shoulders back to Jerusalem. Do you really think it was the true cross?
I mean, probably not.
Yeah, because you'd think they would have just discarded it.
Yeah, because I mean, that's like
used it for some other purpose, or another crucifixion, or they would have burned it or something. You can of course, I don't think they had the same concept of hygiene that we do. It's like, they wouldn't have just destroyed it.
We don't want to reuse this cross. The next guy might get sick while he's up there being crucified to death.
Well, I was thinking about it for another purpose other than crucifixion.
Okay.
You don't want that as your floor.
That's true.
I don't mean to make light of Jesus' crucifixion. I'm just talking about like you couldn't repurpose that wood for some.
That is true.
So you'd think that when they're done using it for crucifixions, but I don't know. Would you reuse it? Because it'd probably be a god bloody mess. I mean, maybe you don't want to reuse that because obviously he had to carry half of it. Didn't he just carry one cross piece, or did he carry the whole crucifix? I never knew the answer to that.
I thought it was the whole crucifix.
The whole thing?
The whole cross. When it's a crucifix, he's on it. But yeah.
That's true. Sorry. Thank you for that language interjection.
You're welcome. That's what I'm here for.
So then of course there's a lot of court intrigues. This whole chapter is full of them, which I find so fascinating. Those time periods. But anyway, that they're however, as an author says, however powerful emperors sometimes fell victim to plots.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a Phocas, Phocas, seized the throne for Maurice. Had his 5 sons killed, only to be killed himself 8 years later. Then Constantine the sixth.
There you go. That's a Roman
numeral. Yeah, was blinded and left to die at the instigation of his mother, Irene, who was herself subsequently forced into a convent. She probably needed to be in a convent. I wonder. I have in my notes. Wow, what kind of mother is that? But
not a good one.
Yes, but we have modern day people that are not powerful that are subjecting their children to gender surgeries. So, who are we to judge when this lady blinded her kid? We got modern middle-aged liberal white women cutting off their sons. You know what? And they aren't even doing it for power. They're just doing it for attention.
That's a good point.
I like that. How do you like that for a modern point in the East and West discussion?
That's a great point, Dad.
So yeah, I'll just move along. And never mind. I'm going to try to keep it focused and tight today because I was about to go on a whole completely unrelated subject.
I know. I could see it in your eyes.
Had nothing to do with even the subject I was talking about. So let's see. I don't know that we need to talk anymore. There's just a whole bunch of court intrigues and the church state issues. The more the government was involved in the church, the more complex it got. And
yes,
we could talk about those, but anyway, so there's then the next topic the author brings up is monasticism. Did they have monasteries? Mm-hmm. They didn't have as many as in the West, which I think I knew before reading this. But they'd had some, but they had differences, and I don't know if it's mentioned in this section, but that the monasteries in the East were, I guess you'd say, managed to their early monasteries in the West, where you'd have maybe only a couple priests, the rest of them, I guess, would be brothers, or whatever you want to call them in the monastery. But we'll get to that, I guess, a little bit. There was. I thought this was kind of funny, where they monks from a variety of places went to this one place. Was it Mount Athos, a remote part of Greece? And they went to this particular place to establish monasteries of such rigor that not even female animals were allowed in the peninsula.
And I think I've heard that that's still a monastery that exists to this day, because there was somebody who made news a while back because they believe that he was a man who had literally never seen a woman in his entire life.
Yeah.
At least since he was an infant, because I think that the story was that his mother died, I think, shortly after childbirth, and he was taken to this monastery to be taken care of by their relative or something that lived there, and so he spent literally his entire life without having seen a woman since he was born.
Huh. I wonder what you think of them.
Of women.
Yes, a woman. If you've never seen a woman before.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I don't know. We should ask that guy. Maybe he could be on our last episode. Hey, what'd you see when you saw your first chick? They're oddly lumpy. There's silent laughter coming from your end of this podcast. Like, what do you mean? So emperors and popes, the emperors, the popes continued to be elected at Rome, but the emperors ratified their election, which, during the 6th and 7th centuries, most of the popes were Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that, who had either been attracted to Rome as the capital of the church or come as refugees from imperial conflicts, according to the author. And so there was these ecclesiastical authority, as I mentioned, but as the author says more appropriately or effectively, ecclesiastical authority was closely intertwined with secular politics.
Yeah,
that's an understatement, I think.
Yeah, no kidding.
And then during these periods of time, when there were quarrels between churches in the Eastern, like in every Eastern quarrel, they ended up being addressed to Rome for a final authority. So for a long period of time, they still considered, yeah, and we're in communion with the Catholic Church. They consider the Pope to be the final authority. And there's a mention of during the 5th century, popes twice rebuked emperors for supporting heresy, reminding them of the necessity of being in communion with the see of the apostles at Rome, as opposed to whoever the local guy was.
Yeah. But then I think it's quite telling. The next section, I don't want to cut you off, is titled The Second Rome,
Yeah,
where he talks about Constantinople, the spiritual authority there. He says that it's precarious because it wasn't an apostolic see, but had been founded late and really just owed its prestige just because it was the capital of the empire. So it was never like a theological center. It was just because, they had earlier moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople, and that's why it had authority. So it's this weird sort of, why should you really appeal here? There's no theological tradition, but this is the center of secular power here in the East,
right.
which is very interesting.
Yes, and I saw a parallel with that um, beautiful cathedral in Washington D.C., which I guess I think you said it was like the largest
largest
footage,
the largest Roman Catholic church in North America,
America, and
which is the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, by the way, or the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, for anyone who's curious.
And as we got out of our Uber and we're walking up the steps, your brother said, "What a complete waste of money." I thought that was so good. I was like, "Oh, that's a good point." Because I mean, it's a beautiful church, but I don't consider, I don't think Washington D.C. is our faith capital of the nation, but it's certainly the power center, which it shouldn't
where
be.
the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops meets. So,
and I wonder why that is. It's not a population center. It's certainly not a center of Catholics. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of Catholics in Washington, D.C., but I don't think that's a center of Catholic thought. I don't think it's a center of Catholics just by population. It's just because that's where all the powerful people are. And I think a lot of those bishops want to be in the center of that. Anyway.
St. Louis.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, why not?
Yeah.
Or at least Chicago. Chicago had a huge Catholic population. I
also, New York, I guess, could be an option too, but
Boston. I mean, Boston's got a bunch of this Boston Catholics,
Irish Catholics.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So that's my thought. I mean, like I said, I'm sure they have a number of Catholic, parishioners there or whatever, but there's really no reason for the Conference of Catholic Bishops to be in Washington D.C. I mean, it's gonna be harder to meet there anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, hotel rooms like crazy open here in St. Louis.
That's true.
And they wouldn't have as much to distract them.
Yeah.
From jobs. It'll be like the old times where there's mention, where they're trying to select a pope or whether they're in a conference or whatever. I was reading about the book and they were on a house arrest. They couldn't even leave the monastery or whatever they're meeting at. They should do it.
That's what we should do. We should make them meet in East St. Louis and say you can't leave East St. Louis until you come to a decision. You're stuck.
East St. Louis tends to be a den of vices.
That's a good point, actually.
You hopefully do not know that, but although there is a nice casino there and they're making efforts.
Well, there you go.
But really anyway, I don't need to go on that path. So let's see, where are we at? So we're talking about there's a how do you pronounce that word? The patriarchates?
Patriarchate, yeah.
And basically they had patriarchs, like we have bishops, and that's basically just a different term for it, and different areas. Let's see, do I want to talk about any of that?
Well, I thought
they have lineage to St. Mark the Evangelist in the 9th century when the city was under Muslim control. Venetian adventurers took the apostles' body to Venice, where the magnificent Byzantine-style St. Mark's Basilica was built to house it. Isn't it interesting?
And then he says, based on this, the archbishops of Venice have ever since been called patriarchs. So we do technically, I guess, have one patriarch in the Catholic Church, the Western Catholic Church, and that is the Patriarch of Venice.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yes. So, let's see. Do we want to talk about? We'll talk about the complex relations. So there's all sorts of stuff here, or Theodoric, the Arian, not like German Nazi Arian, but Arian Astrogothic king of Italy, was sent Pope John I to Constantinople to ask the Emperor Justin I to tolerate the Arians, but upon John's return, Theodoric threw him in prison where he died.
That's rough.
Yeah. And then so let's see, this is the author says both popes were treated with. Oh, so there's a couple discussions about these popes going over there to visit with them. They were treated with great honors in the imperial capital. And one pope who visited there was bold enough to depose a patriarch of Constantinople. Is that Agapetus? Agapetus?
Iapetus the First.
Agapetus first. How many Agapituses were there?
I don't know. It's not a very common name. Don't hear
More than
many
one.
Agapituses these days.
More than one, I guess,
I
because
guess
you would just be Agapetus.
that's true.
Um, so then beginning in 556, the popes no longer sought confirmation of their election from the emperors. And when Emperor Justinian II attempted this is he was
Reigned from 685 to 695.
attempted to impose various Eastern disciplinary practices on the West. Pope Saint Sergius I rejected his authority. That's good. And then there's the Phocian schism.
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 Yes, schism. You're saying it right the first time. You don't need to keep saying it.
I like this guy. I think he must have been a cool emperor. Emperor Michael III, the drunkard, deposed Patriarch Ignatius of Constantinople and appointed the layman Photius in his place, an act that Pope Nicholas I denounced after Ignatius appealed to him. Photius soon claimed authority in southern Italy, and Nicholas excommunicated him, whereupon Photius accused the Western Church of heresy because of the doctrine of purgatory and the word filioque in the creed.
Filioque.
Filioque.
That's the and the Son. So the Holy Spirit, comes from the Father and the Son. The Eastern Orthodox does not like that. So I'm guessing that's where this really started and led to big political shifts. Because the Byzantine Council declared Nicholas deposed, and there's an imperial coup. A new emperor, Basil I, sent Photius to a monastery, restored Ignatius, on and on and on. Fourth Council of Constantinople affirmed the authority of Rome, but the council was later repudiated in the East. So after that point, this is sort of the beginning, I think, of the really big schism, because he says the extent of papal authority remained uncertain in the East. In 903, Emperor Leo VI, having been widowed 3 times, married a 4th wife, for which he was excommunicated by the Eastern bishops. He obtained a dispensation from Rome, but then the East didn't recognize it. So it's like, really, this is the beginning of the major split between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, and that was I guess I don't know if I mentioned the date. 858 was when the Michael III, the drunkard, set this chain of events in motion. So
maybe if he was a little more sober, there would be no schism between the Eastern Orthodox and the Western Catholics.
Yeah, I wonder what I need to read about him, because I had some pretty good stories.
It's interesting. The author doesn't say why he was called the drunkard, but
probably not relevant for our discussions.
I guess not.
Probably because he drank a lot of alcohol.
I would imagine so. That's a good point.
Then there's a discussion of it had always, Rome had always been the ultimate authority or arbiter of orthodoxy. We had these they would call the councils, and the councils would meet other places, but then they would be up to the Pope to be the final authority.
Yeah.
And the author notes that the East was the hatching ground of almost all heresies. So all these kind of unique thoughts or different thoughts that were ultimately determined to be heresies almost always came from the East. And I like this little quote here. When an emperor patronizingly told a Western visitor that Westerners manifested a naive, childlike faith, the visitor admitted the claim, but replied that the faith of the East was like an old, worn-out garment. Okay. So then there's this whole concept of monophysitism. Pronounce it for me.
Monophysitism.
So what is that?
Monophysitism.
That's the deification, where you can get closer and closer to divinity by being a better and better person, right?
Yeah, he says it's largely unknown in the West, but was really sort of popular in the East. And he says the reason that it wasn't, present in the West is because it was very similar to the heresy of Pelagianism. Very easy fall into that. They hold that more strongly, I think, still in the Eastern Orthodox.
Well, do you sympathize with that point of view, where through grace men can become progressively more like God?
I mean, I think we're supposed to act like Jesus. I think we should try to do that. But I don't think we will become divine in any way on earth.
Um, through I agree, but that's not quite an answer.
Yeah.
Through this, you can become progressively more like God.
I mean, I guess in sort of an abstract way. I mean, I don't think you'll ever be like, you know, free from sin in any capacity. But I do think you could make better decisions if you like, I don't know, because I feel like it's almost like self-fulfilling. Like if you become a better person, you're going to become a better person. You know what I mean? I
Yes,
don't know. I don't really buy it as like a school of thought.
that is correct. That is you finally came down to the correct answer. Instead, it's
Thank
wrong.
you. Did you want to tell us why?
I think we know. I don't think we can get more like God.
Yeah.
I think, well, I guess if I would say is if you could get, if you're a better person, in theory, you're more like God.
Yeah.
But it's such a infinitesimal difference
Hmm.
because the gulf between us and God is so vast.
Hmm.
It's like, okay, if I take a cup of water and I pour it in the ocean, did I make the ocean bigger? I guess so. But how do you measure that?
Yeah, that's true.
And I guess if you sinned, do you go back to the start?
I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. Anyway, because then as you get closer and closer, you're gonna be thinking more and more of yourself, and so you're gonna end up having, becoming more arrogant.
That is true.
Bam, back to the beginning. I thought this story of another person I want to read about, if there's any books about her, Theodora. What
Hmm.
do you think about Theodora? I mean,
That is interesting.
this lady, they said she may have even it came from lowly roots, I guess you'd say. And according to some accounts, she was at once in a time a prostitute.
Hmm.
She was a woman of extraordinary ability, according to the author.
Yeah, and she was the wife of Justinian. She eventually ended up marrying him, and so she really supported the Monophysites. Interestingly,
Yeah. Well, she got better get better in some ways,
I guess that's true.
and she say the Pope, Saint Agabus the First,
Epidus.
whatever, went to Constantinople to counteract Theodora's influence to plead with Justinian not to invade Italy, but he died while in Constantinople,
Mm.
and his armies retook Rome shortly thereafter. Um, so Justinian's armies retook Rome shortly thereafter, and Theodora was then able to secure the election of the anti-pope
Vigil-
Vigilius, and rivalry to the newly elected Saint
Silverius.
Silverius. God, I can't get any of these right. And this is a guy we already talked about, I think, because he was deposed in exile and he died of starvation. I think we
Yeah,
already talked about him,
we did.
which is a bad way to die.
That is bad.
I
No,
guess
but
I
I
wonder
mean,
if people were forced not to provide him with food or something.
maybe it's possible.
Yeah, because you'd think that somebody would give him a sandwich. I used to be Pope. Give me a sandwich. No. Yeah, something happened there.
Yeah.
Anyway, so life of the Eastern Church.
Hmm.
So, as the author says, theological disputes in the East extended even to the level of common people, and not infrequently erupted into violence, fueled by obscure and illogical links that existed between theological opinions and loyalty to a particular team of professional charioteers. I was like, "Whoa!" What? When I was reading that the first time, I'm like, "Okay, here goes." I'm thinking to particular. I was thinking political parties or something,
Yeah.
but it was the two charioteers. So I guess there would be like I don't know, a Pope team or something, or there's a
Like if the St. Louis Cardinals came out and were like, "Hey, we need you guys to go beat up a bunch of Lutherans for us. We don't like what they're preaching. Go get them."
Lutherans almost Catholic. You had to use
That's
somebody,
true.
but I don't want to name anybody because somebody might say, "Well, you want to beat up Baptists or something."
That's true.
I do not. But anyway, so there Nike riots.
Hmm.
But Nike, I guess, means win. Is that in Latin or is it in Greek? That's in Greek.
That's well, both. Nike is the goddess of victory.
Yes.
Yes.
Which one? Both?
I think so. I
Oh,
think her name stays the same. I could be wrong there, but I think it's originally Greek, but I think it's kept very similar in
so Justinian was almost driven from Constantinople in these Nike riots,
Yeah.
which may have been partly caused by Theodoro's support of the Monophysites. He
Mhm.
reportedly had 30,000 people put to death as punishment. Do you think that's accurate? That's a lot of people.
A lot of people. I also just looked it up. Nike, or Nike, is how it would be pronounced in Greek, is equivalent to Victoria in Latin, which makes sense. Victory, Victoria. So did change. My apologies.
Apologies.
I let our listeners astray.
So monothelitism. Monothelitism?
Monothelitism.
Monothelitism.
You are really struggling today.
So much of words I read. It reminds me of it's well known in our family of your brother Sam.
Hmm.
Was a voracious reader when
Mhm.
especially when he was very, very young, early reader, and he would inadvertently mispronounce words that he'd only seen written, and for whatever reason he got into like muscle cars for a couple books, and so he was reading about those, and he says, "Hey, look, that's a Camaro." I'm like, what's a Camaro? He says, Camaro, and he's pointing. He's a little kid. I mean, he's like probably kindergarten. That's a Camaro. And evidently he liked Camaros. I said, I don't know what you're pointing at, but all I see is that car. He's like, yes, the car. I said, the Camaro? He says, what? He said, oh, that's how you say it. So
That's
there's like a bunch of examples of that. So that's I'm feeling he had an excuse. He was like 5.
Mhm.
Anyway, what we were talking about, this concept, why don't you explain it?
Yeah.
Unless you want.
No, I can do it. The Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople proposed that Christ had only one will, which is this theory of monothelitism, which is interesting. It was opposed, for a couple of reasons, but also, particularly because in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's praying,
Yes.
deliver me from this suffering that I'm about to endure, essentially, that kind of shows that he is not just of one will. He has to have both the divine and the human will, and eventually that does become church doctrine. The Third Council of Constantinople in 680 affirmed that Christ had both a human and a divine will, and that he experienced all human emotions except sinful ones, and condemned this guy Honorius, who was a pope who accepted this monothelitism from 625 to 638. So that was also a big thing that I think remained sort of in the East, this idea of monothelitism, the idea that Christ only had one nature.
One nature, one will, one kind
or
of
one will.
maybe,
Yeah.
which I sympathize with. I mean, it makes a certain amount of sense, but the whole concept of the Trinity is very confusing.
Yes, that's true.
It's very very deep and convoluted, and sometimes almost contradictory.
Yeah.
So I get it, but yeah, it doesn't make sense with the story of him praying, or he's often goes off in prayer. Well, why would you even have to do that? If it's like this individual will. I mean, I guess you could say, well, he has multiple personalities.
Maybe.
Yeah, well,
I guess.
in person.
Yeah, multiple persons.
There's a famous movie called Sybil, which was about a young gal that had multiple personalities.
I've never heard of it.
It was a big deal in like the late 70s, early 80s. Might have been whenever it was released. I'm a kid, and it might have even been a TV movie. Anyway, very it was a story about a girl who had been basically tortured by her mother, and so she created these multiple personalities to kind of compartmentalize their memories and of the abuse.
Interesting.
Anyway, I just kind of ruined the ending for you.
Oh, that's a shame.
Sybil.
I wasn't going to watch it.
Someday you will. I'll make you. Maximus the Confessor is the next section, who is the last of the great Greek fathers. Had been secretary to Emperor Heraclitus, 610 to 641.
Heraclius.
That's what I just said. Became a monk and was savagely mutilated for his opposition to that monothelitism. And Maximus was the most prestigious of the various Easterners who acknowledged the primacy of Rome. I can't even speak. I don't even know why I'm on this thing. I don't know what well, it's later than normal.
That is true. Do you want me to take over for the rest of the episode?
I don't know, because I'm not making any headway.
Yeah, that's true. Do you want me to take over? I could take over.
I don't know. I kind of feel yes, take over.
Okay.
Because I'm going slow. I'm
You
talking
are.
slowly. Usually I'm like double speed. I've told you, I think the last time maybe I had a stroke or something.
I
But,
hope not.
but especially like on Mondays, it's not yet Monday, I know. But Mondays, I wake up and I'm like, I feel like I'm in a fog.
Mm.
And I have a radio program. Did I tell you I have a radio program?
You did, yeah.
So I haven't told our audience, I don't think.
I don't think so.
So I have a radio program called Legally Speaking, which
Hmm.
is every other Monday on an AM station that no one will listen to. Oh, well, nobody listens to this, so it's not like they're going to find out I said that nobody listens to the other one. The secret is safe with you. I tell you, it's hard because it's first in the morning before I even go into the office, and I'm like, oh, I gotta start. I gotta come up with a whole thing too. I'm creating
Hmm.
the show from nothing. So any ideas about legal issues you want me to talk about on an AM radio station in Festus, Missouri? I'm all ears. Anyway, go ahead, take it away.
That's great. That was a great interjection. You could tweet at us any suggestions you have at ULMTD Opinions if you have any suggestions for him on topics for legally speaking.
I'm thinking about just talking about Trump's indictments for the next 6 months, but I don't think they want me to get all political on it. It's supposed to be like, do you have any questions about estate planning? Because they want people to call in and stuff. But
I see.
or like rent and possession cases, stuff that people actually affects people.
Yes. All right, let's talk about the liturgy in the Eastern Church.
Yes.
Yes, the author says the church had three distinct liturgies, each attributed to St. James the Less, St. Basil, and St. John Chrysostom, respectively. The differences were using languages other than Greek, leavened bread, so bread that had risen, unwatered wine, and the epiclesis of the Holy Spirit to descend upon the communion elements in order to make Christ present. He also says Eucharist was not celebrated daily in the East, and also had different forms of baptism. So confirmation in the East was administered by chrismating, or anointing the newly baptized baby. The infant was then given communion. And I think that's still a thing that they do. They have all three of those sort of sacraments of initiation right at the same time. So instead, we have baptism as an infant, and then usually first communion in second grade, and then confirmation in eighth grade, at least in the U.S. But they're split up throughout different stages.
So I wonder how big the communion is they give to the little babies.
Yeah, I don't know.
Not eating food.
That's true.
What do they do if they spit it out? You know how babies they chew on stuff and they just kind of like comes out of their lips. It's all mushy. You ever try to feed like a baby something solid? They're not supposed to have they're not supposed to have solid food. They just kind of they don't have teeth, they just gum it. Then it kind of comes out this slobbery, mushy thing. And they don't know to swallow it. It's not milk. What are they going to do with this? Well, they shove it up its nose. What is useful? Are you okay over there? I think I lost you.
Back to the book. This is a good tangent, I think. He says in the West, the experience of, or in the East, the experience of worship was intended to offer a foretaste of heaven. So long chants, lots of solemnity and splendor. The walls of churches were often covered in mosaics or paintings of biblical scenes. And they also had an iconostasis, which is a gated wall adorned with holy images, separated the altar from the body of the church, so that you could only occasionally glimpse the sacred Eucharistic act, which is interesting. I think that's something that we used to have sort of in the Western Rite that isn't present as much anymore.
Yeah, his description of the Eastern liturgy I found compelling.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that seems like a pretty cool thing. I need to go to some Eastern Orthodox church and see what's going on out there.
Yeah. He also says the dome was a big.
Come back to Rome. You heretics. You heretics. No, you're chanting.
Well, I think they're technically schismatics. They're not technically heretics. I think there's a difference.
Oh, yeah, I know. I was just meaning to insult them.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. He mentions that the dome was very important in the East, perhaps derived from the Platonic idea of the circle as the perfect form. This is whereas in the West, your eye sort of goes up to just where you can't see the ceiling. But of course, in the Eastern churches, they have the big domes lined with mosaics, typically meant to represent heaven.
I wonder if it's really just not so much intentional as they were just better at building domes. I mean, like if you could build a dome like the Eastern churches could build. It's so beautiful.
Yeah,
It's so inspiring. I think it's just a different way. You know what I'm saying? I don't know that it was like, oh, we want to do it differently. I
yeah,
think they
that's true.
did it differently. I don't know,
Yeah,
but
I think that's possible. And there's
yeah.
a big long discussion of icons, which is
Yeah.
a huge deal for a lot of different denominations and such. But he says icons or images were introduced as a way of making heaven concretely imaginable, the images of its inhabitants. But he says the East usually forbade the use of three-dimensional images, but were okay with two-dimensional paintings and stuff. But they wouldn't have any three-dimensional images. They were really seen as icons. They seem to think that they took it too far by making them three-dimensional. And
I
so there,
guess they really didn't like very good painters. You know, because it looks three-dimensional. Kick him out.
that's true.
See, he's an
Uh,
iconophile.
yeah,
He's
there
an
you go.
image lover.
Exactly. But before we talk about that, we have to talk about iconoclasm. It says the greatest crisis in the history of the Eastern Church was precisely over these images. Beginning in 730, Emperor Leo III condemned their use, possibly as a way of moving closer to the Jews and the Muslims, which I thought was interesting because I guess they don't really use images very heavily in their temples or their mosques.
Right.
As the church became bitterly divided over the issue, Pope St. Gregory II, who reigned from 715 to 731, upheld the use of icons. Leo sent a fleet to arrest him, but was wrecked en route. And the iconoclasts, which means an image breaker, insisted that icons of Jesus separated his divine and human natures, since you cannot visualize the divine. And so you're trying to kind of separate the physical from the divine here. And then that would lead to polytheism or to idolatry. He says, the representation of the saint was the replication of his virtues in the life of the believer. So, we can still depict the saints, just not Jesus. That's a big no-no. And they also said that, they didn't like the images of the saints. The iconoclasts insisted the cross was the only legitimate image, especially to represent Jesus.
Yeah, and I wonder if it was just it just seems such a almost like an academic or such a theoretical discussion for us. But I guess in those times you had the worship of idols,
Mhm.
like that you really venerated, like a statue of Apollo or
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah.
So maybe it was more of an issue then because they made such a big deal about it. And even not modern day, the people don't like the Catholic Church because of these statues in there and the worship of Mary or worship of the saints. But I think a lot of that's more because we pray for intercessions, and I
Mhm.
think I think it's more of a philosophical argument about hey whether they can intercede. It's a third party and why you're praying to them and not God and all
Well,
that.
it's probably also like an economic thing more so than it is today, because I think now in the modern times we're very used to spending money on superfluous things. But if you see this church that's
Mhm.
lined with all these mosaics and with these beautifully carved sculptures, it's like who's paying for this? This is what I'm tithing for you to build a statue of this guy. It's I can kind
Mhm.
of see that aspect as well. If especially if you don't believe that benefits you in any way.
Yeah. I also found it really weird that the people in the East are against these images, the three-dimensional images, but they venerated all these. Oh God, I just lost the word again. I lost the word last time. The pieces of the body of the saints and stuff.
Relics,
The what?
the relics.
Yeah, the relics. I mean, if anything, it seems like some sort of worship of something else. It's the relics.
Yeah,
It's like,
they were okay
hey,
with worshiping
oh,
or
yeah,
praying with the relics. Yeah,
that's right. I just thought that
or
was weird.
veneration, not really worship.
Yeah, veneration. Yeah, the relics and almost like an intercession type thing. That too. Anyway, but go ahead. Sorry,
But
I
he
interrupted.
continues by talking about iconophilia. The iconophiles or image lovers, or iconojewels, which means image worshippers, thought of the iconoclasts as Judaizers still attached to the old law. And they defended, this ancient practice that had deep theological meaning. They thought possible to ascend the ladder of being to God through a series of steps, of which visible images were one stage. So, if you want to be like God, you got to look at people who are very close to being like God, I guess, has some sort of logic to it. He talks about St. John of Damascus, who died in 749, was the most important theologian of the age, who pointed out that the Jews did have images, notably in the Ark of the Covenant, and icons represented the history of Christ in the same way as the Gospels did. In the same way that you would read a book, you can look at the images on the walls of a church and sort of read the history of your faith, which I think is a good argument. If we're saying no images, why do we have a book?
Right. And what struck me is that like this whole idea of you have an image of a saint or a holy person so that you get an idea of being closer to God because of who they were,
Mhm.
but none of them were ugly.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
I mean, they might have been ugly, but the statues were not of ugly people. I mean, the only people that are really statues that are ugly are like some of those demons from, well, demons, like that type of sort of thing, or like from Roman or Greek gods, like Medusa or something. Although
Yeah,
I don't, you couldn't carve her because you would turn to stone. But
yeah, it's true. But the story of the icons ends with the icons being restored, with the Empress Irene, who reigned from 780 to 803, restoring them in 787, when the Second Council of Nicaea reversed Emperor Leo III's ruling. So he ruled against icons. But of course, the two parties, of course, just argued amongst themselves for a very long time, until Empress Theodora II restored the icons permanently in 843. And of course, that was, ratified in certain councils and arguments between, Pope Paschal I and Emperor Leo V, et cetera, et cetera, back and forth, sort of as we've been reading here, it's never really a settled deal between the East and the West, especially here in the icons.
I think it's settled now, though. The Catholics love statues.
Yes, well, that's true.
I don't know if the Eastern Orthodox churches have a lot of statues. I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know. I think they have a lot of, I know they still have a lot of mosaics and paintings and such, but I
Yes.
don't know about
Yeah.
specifically
Yeah.
statues. I know
Which
they're
they
usually
most,
finely adorned.
yes. I need to go visit some.
Mm.
I knew a person. I only know one person who is Eastern Orthodox.
Really?
Yes, and he is now in federal prison.
Well,
Completely unrelated to his religion.
I hope so.
But he's the only person I know that I've met that is
Yeah,
Eastern.
I've never met an Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah, there's a church here in St. Louis.
Oh, interesting.
Anyway,
Yes. Then he goes to talk about holy men. This is connected to the veneration of icons. It's a cult of wandering holy men, believed to have great spiritual power, often attracted large popular followings. But emperors and bishops didn't really like them because, they're kind of, I guess, the modern day equivalent of like the televangelists, sort of, follow me, I'll show you the way. And of course, that was at odds with the hierarchy. And in the 8th and 9th centuries, there was organized campaigns against them, and some were put to death. So, stop doing that, guys. Then there's also survival of dualism, which is, the suspicion that iconoclasm is at heart Gnostic, or, we can't really, know God, generally things are evil, stuff like that. And, that just led to the Bogomiles and Paulicians, which was just varieties of dualism and such. That forced Christian apologists once more to affirm the goodness of all creation. And then we move on to sort of Pseudo Dionysius here, who was alive, we think, around 500, but he sort of reflected the Neoplatonic philosophy in the account of the soul's ascent to God by stages. So that really goes along with the deification principle there. It's how do you actually get to be like God? Of course, he laid that out step by step. And we talked about the nature of sin as well here, is talking about these theological concepts. And he says Augustine of Hippo had brought Western theology to a level equal to that of the East. But the East was losing knowledge of Latin, so they didn't have access up to a certain point of really any of his works. So they didn't really have these really, concrete, overall encompassing writings on like theology and stuff. So, Augustine held that original sin was transmitted from parent to child through the very act of conception. But for Maximus, who was Maximus the Confessor, an Eastern theologian, held that it was, mankind shared in Adam's sin only in the sense of having a propensity for evil, not as something basic to human nature. So just differences there, where you just don't have access to the writings of these people anymore.
Right.
But Marian devotion was especially strong, and this actually had like a theological backing in the East. Because if you believe in this concept of deification, well, naturally Mary would be the furthest along. She physically bore, God gave birth to God, and salvation had come through her son, and therefore through her. And so this, sort of had the idea that Mary was conceived without sin in the West, but that really wasn't too prevalent in the East. They kind of believed it, but you don't have that same prominence of the Immaculate Conception, just because of the doctrine of original sin was also vaguer. You talk about Simeon, the new theologian, who's the most important Eastern theologian in the Middle Ages, lived late in the 11th century. But his approach was very mystical, based primarily on the liturgy and experience of monastic life. So very different from the Western theologians at this time, when they're really trying to set up, full schools of thought, sort of scholasticism, a few, not too long after this guy was around. So you see sort of the differences here between the more spiritual East and the more sort of academic West. Prayers for the dead. The Eastern Church doesn't really believe in prayers for the dead because of differences in beliefs in in purgatory. because the Eastern Church.
And I guess purgatory just came up after the Bible, right? I mean, there's no reference to purgatory in the Bible, is there?
Um, I forget what the basis is. I think there are some references to like waiting. I think after death. I think they're in the books that Martin Luther took out of the Bible.
Oh,
Yeah, which makes sense.
yeah. Well, anyway, sorry I interrupted you.
No, you're all right. But the Eastern Church didn't really, believe in the necessity of praying for the dead, because they prayed for the dead, but they didn't really elaborate why you should, because they didn't have this, full thought out, school of purgatory. In the East, the doctrine of purgatory looks suspiciously like the heresy of Origen, that the damned will eventually be released from hell, which of course not what purgatory is. Purgatory,
Right.
all souls in purgatory are destined for heaven, but they have to have a purification process first.
Yeah.
And then we go into adiaphora, which is interesting, is this acknowledgement that things were indifferent in terms of doctrinal orthodoxy, but were nonetheless points of difference between West and East. So these sort of not overall grand theological divisions, not heresy one way or the other, but just differences in tradition. It seems like leavened or unleavened bread, drop of water in the wine of the Eucharist. These weren't easily resolved just because there were really embedded customs, but they aren't really crucial to the overall theological thought of either school.
Right.
But one of these was sort of more important. I don't mean to cut you off if you had something to say
Okay.
there.
That's right. Good.
With clerical marriage, the Eastern Church still allowed clerical marriage, although bishops were drawn exclusively from the ranks of the celibate. So if you were a priest, you could be married, but if you wanted to go up higher, you couldn't be married.
That doesn't make any sense to me. But I guess if you're not married and celibate, you'd have more time to devote to your studies, I guess, and be a better leader, a better bishop. But I don't know that really would bear itself out. But anyway.
But the distinction of the filioque was the biggest thing. The idea that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son, he says, was the most substantive disagreement. So the word had first been inserted into the creed under Charlemagne, but Pope Leo III declined to make it universal, and no one, sort of denied it, but some Easterners affirmed it, but overall the East viewed it as an improper innovation. So they don't necessarily deny this, but they're like, why is the emperor putting in words in the creed of our faith? We don't like that. We're not going to say it. And so it was a big deal to them. But they did have missionary efforts, beginning with Justinian's uncle and predecessor, Justin I, who reigned from 518 to 527. The church at Constantinople sent missionaries to the parts of the Near East that remained pagan, including Ethiopia and Arabia, the Black Sea region, and southeastern Europe. And he says Christians existed in the Persian Empire during the 4th century, were persecuted by adherents of Zoroastrianism. And he says Nestorianism survived there and in Syria, India, and parts of China, which was missionized from Persia, which I thought was interesting that we even have it's getting all the way over to China, really in like the 4th, 5th century there, which is pretty wild.
Not really that far, I mean, it's far from here, but if you have a strong presence in Persia, they traded so much with China, it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, he mentions also, kind of lists a couple of the groups that were, sort of, converted by the Orthodox, the Eastern Church, the Bulgars of southeastern Rome, the Bohemians of southeastern Europe, the Bohemians of Central Europe, the Poles, Kievan Russians, and usually that was done, through a king or a prince, converting one person who then converts his whole people. And then he has this whole story about Cyril and Methodius.
I thought you'd like this story.
This is a great story. No, I've heard this before. So Constantine, who died in 869, Methodius, who died in 885, in a sense, founded Eastern European Christianity. They're men of importance in Constantinople. And although Rome and Constantinople were not as yet in schism, there was a rivalry in Eastern Europe over patriarchal oversight in the liturgy. So these two brothers both spoke the Slavic language, and they were sent to the kingdom of Greater Moravia, which encompassed much of Central Europe and part of Poland. It was a battleground between Germanic and Byzantine influence. And so the brothers developed a written Slavic language and composed a vernacular liturgy in that language, whose liturgical use came to be called Old Church Slavonic. In 867, the brothers visited Rome, where Pope Hadrian II, reigned from 867 to 872, approved their liturgy, and Constantine then entered a monastery taking the name Cyril. He died afterward and was later commemorated in the Slavic alphabet that later came to be known Cyrillic. So it's named after this guy because he invented the whole alphabet with his brother, which I think is really cool.
Now, the Cyrillic alphabet, is that what they use primarily like for Russian and
Yes.
Ukrainian? Yeah,
Yes.
so
So for Russian, it's really very similar to the Greek alphabet. So it's an adaptation of the Greek alphabet, but specifically for the sounds of the Slavic languages. So that would be, yeah. So yeah, Russian, Ukrainian, a couple other countries use it as well, like in the Balkans. But yeah, generally Slavic languages, and it's been adopted in other places as well.
pretty cool.
Indeed. Let's talk about the Great Schism. So this is the big deal here.
This is the big deal.
Yes, the great one. It
And
says,
it's over a bunch of little stuff, it seems to me. I
yeah,
thought it was a bigger deal, but
I think that's why they're considered schismatics and not heretics, because it's over a bunch
yeah,
of little stuff and a lot of secular stuff, a
yeah,
lot of like the politics of it.
right, right.
It says here, Michael Carularius, who died in 1059, was a patriarch of Constantinople and showed such independence that he clashed with the emperor himself. And so he opposed a lot of these Western practices, the filioque, priestly celibacy, unleavened bread, so aggressively that he closed the Latin churches in a city. And so in response, Pope Leo IX in 1054 sent a delegation to Constantinople, and they received a friendly welcome from the Emperor Constantine IX. But Carularius's intransigence was matched by Humbert, who led this delegation and pronounced an excommunication of the patriarch, placed his decree on the altar of Hagia Sophia. So he says, this really marks the final split between Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, but it wasn't really seen so at the time. And he says, among other things, the force of the decree was doubtful because Leo IX died during the episode. So the Pope, who would have had the authority, allegedly this excommunication came from him, but he was probably dead by this point by the time it was placed on the throne in the Hagia Sophia, which
Was
is
I
a pretty bold statement to do.
was I understand it, the excommunication was done by Humbert, who was
Mhm.
a cardinal he sent there, and
Yeah.
so it wasn't necessarily an excommunication from the Pope.
Mhm.
So that's why the order was in doubt because the Pope died somewhere in there, as you explained.
And theoretically, the excommunication would have been authorized by the Pope, I
Yeah,
believe. I think he has the final say, and so it's if he died, at what point was this written and drafted and such.
correct. And whether an appeal to the Pope would have changed
Mhm.
it, you know.
Mhm.
And besides, they probably didn't want to accept it.
Yeah, that's true. Then his discussion of Islam, I thought was really interesting here, and how that
Yeah,
plays into the Eastern Church. Of course, he says, like the West, the Eastern Empire still faced barbarian attacks, but Islam was by now the gravest danger. He says, for the next more than 2 centuries, relationships between East and West were dominated by the Crusades. He says the East usually welcomed the Crusades insofar as they reopened the Holy Land and pushed back the Muslims, but also resisted them because it was also seen as the intrusion of the Western Empire into this sort of their historic lands and stuff like
right.
that. Of course, he talks about Muhammad. Where does Islam come from? Muhammad, who died in 632, claimed to be a prophet, received from the angel Gabriel the revelation that there's only one God, Allah, and all should submit to Allah by following Muhammad. The new faith dated from Muhammad's hijrah, or flight, in 622. He left Mecca for Medina, for which he then mounted a triumphant military return to Mecca. And they developed the Quran, which was not really a complex theology, but it was a collection of sayings of Muhammad, who claimed his statements were revealed by God through Gabriel, and they're compiled after his death and deal primarily with matters of behavior. So laws concerning worship, ascetical practices, and personal conduct for the most part.
I'm still just kind of confused by the appeal, but obviously it has an appeal because there was a series of conquests.
And I think that was the appeal. Is the appeal was, oh, these guys are coming to kill us because they,
No, no,
want to convince us to join their faith. I guess we should join their faith. But he does mention that no religion in history came to dominate so much territory in so brief a time. This is in the period from 638 to 643, so just 5 years. 3 of the 4 Eastern patriarchates, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, fell to those whom the Byzantines called Arabian wolves. Persia was conquered in 652, and all of North Africa by 707. Says the conquest was restrained a little bit by a bitter and permanent split that occurred shortly after Muhammad's death between Shiites, who held that the movement had to be led by a blood relative of the prophet, and Sunnites, who elected their own caliphs. So that's where you get those 2 divisions of the Islamic faith that we still have today.
Yeah, they're divided today.
Yeah. And then, of course, there were schisms within Islam. Principal capitals became Baghdad and Mesopotamia, Damascus and Syria and Cordoba and Spain. The crescent became its symbol. And its conquests were principally at the expense of the Byzantine Empire, But of course, you do go up into the Western Empire, especially when you get into Spain and France and stuff like that, which we talked about in the last episode. And the Muslims reached Constantinople itself in the year 674 to 678, and again in 717 and 718, and repulsed only with difficulty. So, it was really sort of risky for the Eastern Empire at this time. It was possible that they would even be completely wiped out by the Muslims, which is pretty wild.
Yep.
They had a radical monotheism. They were very hostile to anything that appeared to compromise the truth. While Christians were in disagreement for centuries over the use of force in spreading their faith, Muhammad had no such doubts, as the author says, which is true. So the new faith used the sword whenever it encountered resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, people
the focus is effective in war.
And I think that's a good point. I know what he was saying earlier, no religion came to dominate so much territory in so brief a time. And I think that's really why I said it kind of half as a joke. It's this idea of conquest, but I think that's kind of true. Is
Right.
Christianity had such a rapid spread, but that was a spread under constant persecution. And they were always the minority, and they were always the ones who were, being persecuted and being attacked and being killed for the most part. And there were exceptions to that in the early days, but especially in the early days, it was mostly persecution of Christians. But with Islam, it was, we're going to go out and do the killing ourselves. We're going to make sure that our faith spreads, kind of by force here.
Right. Yeah. And in the book even mentions, the converts, few Muslims seem to have converted to Christianity under the empire, but a good number of Christians made the reverse journey because as heretics did not enjoy the patronage of the empire.
Mm-hmm.
So Muslims, while they might be somewhat tolerant, would impose taxes, or so I forget what they call it, but if you were not a Muslim, you'd have to pay more. You couldn't hold any offices, but they may let you live there, but you're literally a second-class citizen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he says
they love to enslave the Christians.
That's true.
Which people forget about, but I mean, to a large extent, I mean, there is some Christian slavery, but it's completely it's minuscule compared to the Christians that were enslaved by the Muslims, because they thought it was an appropriate thing to do to those stupid Christians.
Yeah, well, he even mentions there where he's talking about that if they were captured in battle or by Muslim raiding parties that got as far north as England, they were often enslaved. And the religious order, I've never heard of them, the religious order of the Mercedarians or the buyers was founded especially to ransom them. So you had so many Christian slaves that they had to form this new order of the Catholic Church that specifically had money just to buy back Christians and buy their freedom, which is pretty wild.
Yeah. But all you're doing is feeding it.
Yeah. And then, of course, we get into the Crusades with the Holy Land, with, of course, the Muslims controlling the Holy Land beginning in the 7th century. And Christians, were allowed to visit the holy places, but not to build shrines. Although in 1009, the year, a sultan who was possibly insane had the Church of the Holy Sepulchre destroyed. An attempt was made in 1033 to organize a major pilgrimage to the Holy Land, since Christ had not returned 1,000 years after his death, but would-be pilgrims soon found that the obstacles to such a project were formidable indeed. So it was very, very closed off to Christians, at a certain point there in history. Then we get into the Crusades, which we talked about a little bit last time as well, but sort of here looking at it in the context of the Eastern Church. It says the timing of the first Crusade in 1095 was fortuitous, and that the Muslims themselves were divided. He says the leading Western European monarchs all happened to be excommunicated in 1095, and Urban II appointed a French bishop as the Crusades' official leader. He said as many as 150,000 Christians answered the call, but the difficulties were enormous, and only about 40,000 finally arrived. They met at Constantinople, where they took oaths of fealty to the emperor, whose armies also participated in the war, interestingly enough. Then we talk about the Franks, so the Frankish people, who the Byzantines viewed with misgivings or worse, and the chronicler Anna Comnena, who died in 1148, daughter of the Emperor Alexius Comnenus, saw them as repulsive barbarians. And the Crusaders often ignored their oaths to the emperor, and emperors were not above negotiating secretly with the Muslims against the Crusaders.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of double dealing in that.
Yeah, no kidding.
Word, geez.
He talks about nobility and brutality. He says the contradictions inherent in the Crusade phenomenon were manifest from the beginning, as fierce warriors enlisted in a noble cause sometimes terrorized other Christians before even catching sight of a Muslim, sometimes massacred Muslim towns that fell into their hands. But he also notes the Muslims were equally brutal and had been so long before the Christians arrived.
Right.
Which is a good point. But he does say the first...
And I don't understand. I mean, I do understand a little bit about the obviously there were they got a little carried away, to put it lightly. But to say that like the Crusades were uniquely brutal, or that there were so particularly vile in historical terms, I don't see that to be true.
Mhm.
You see the Muslims sweeping across, conquering peoples and subjugating them and killing them and enslaving them. That's bad.
Yeah,
And a lot of the stuff the Crusaders did was bad,
yeah.
for religious, but it was done for religious reasons. I don't understand why the Crusades are now in the last 30 years seen as some sort of evil
Mhm.
empire thing,
Yeah.
other than it's just people that don't know their history and want to defame Christians, I guess.
Well, I know I've mentioned probably on the podcast before, but as you know, I've done like research into the Berber languages of North Africa. And I'm working with like an undocumented language that exists in this tiny oasis and is spoken by maybe 20 people. And it's like people forget, that Arabic is not the native language of North Africa. The
Right.
Muslims are not
Right.
native to North Africa. The only reason that this language that I'm studying is endangered is because the Muslims came in and literally destroyed everything in North Africa. They came and they conquered everything. So all
Right.
the tradition there for the most part was really lost, and the only reason we even have like Berber people still living is because they either lived in these tiny isolated oases out in the middle of the desert, or they all retreated into the mountains in Western North Africa, out in Morocco and stuff like that. So it's these were not like I just think people forget the history there. If you want to say, oh, the Christians conquered all the pagan lands of Europe and we lost all that tradition and such. Well, look at the Muslims too. Why are we not criticizing them? It's just
Right.
such a double standard, I think.
It's very similar.
Yeah. Oh no, very
Right.
similar.
Right. Right. Right.
Except that the Christians were generally less wipe everything out. We actually documented a lot of stuff, I think, for the most part, but I could be wrong.
Well, and certainly there were contemporary criticisms of it. That's what makes it a little bit different, in that
Yeah.
there were religious leaders even at the time contemporaneously criticizing the massacres,
Yeah.
which,
Yeah.
which you don't see
Mhm.
in some other forces.
And he does mention, as we keep going here back to the book, the First Crusade was somewhat of a success, made steady progress. And he goes on to say there's a great influx of Westerners into the Near East, and a number of Latin churches were established, but Eastern Christians retained their own liturgies. And he talks about the Knights Templar for a little bit, which I thought were interesting. He says in 1118, the Knights Templar were founded at Jerusalem on the site of Solomon's original temple as a community of lay warriors. They observed a monastic rule written for them by Bernard of Clairvaux, which included life in community, vows, and the divine office. He also mentions that the Templars may have possessed the Shroud of Turin, an ancient cloth that bears the image of a crucified man. It is believed by many to be the burial cloth of Jesus. The shroud was probably taken from Constantinople in 1204 and was held by the Templars for the next century, first placed on public display in France in 1357.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We also have the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, who were the Knights Hospitallers, who were founded around the same time as the Templars, but specifically to care for the sick and wounded. So they operated field hospitals and stuff like that. And to this day, a branch of them, the Knights of Malta, still exist as a fraternal order that cares for the sick. But the group long ago gave up its military character, maybe unfortunately.
Yep.
But they built castles all throughout the Christian territories and were the Christians' principal lines of defense. Of course, the Knights of St. John and the Knights Templar. And you also have this guy, Prester John, who's really sort of interesting. The Western Christians in 1122 were given a motive for undertaking expeditions to the east. And a mysterious individual appeared in Rome claiming to be a powerful Christian king of a great unknown kingdom in the east. And Pope Alexander III received a letter purportedly from the same ruler, and the quest for this dude became an occasional minor obsession for the next 4 centuries.
Yeah.
I guess still unresolved if he was a real guy or not.
Yeah. And where his kingdom was.
Yeah, that's true. And then we go on to the second, third, and fourth and fifth crusades here. We just kept trying again. This is Christian states in the Near East struggled to survive during the first half of the 12th century, 1145. The second crusade was preached by Bernard. Crusade gained little. Christians in the Near East remained divided by suspicions. Cities of the Holy Land fell to the Muslims one by one, often accompanied by the slaughter of their inhabitants. In 1187, the great Muslim ruler Saladin retook Jerusalem, allowing the Christians limited toleration. The Third Crusade followed, and that was the largest military effort of the entire Middle Ages, financed by a Saladin tithe. So they had a specific tithe so that they could arm themselves to fight this dude Saladin. and seemed to fulfill the original papal dream of united Christendom, although the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelus, who reigned from 1185 to 1195, did not welcome the Crusaders and secretly negotiated with the Muslims. That's rough. Frederick Barbarossa, Philip II, Augustus of France, and Henry II of England agreed to lead the attack. Henry died before he could set out, replaced by his son Richard I the Lionhearted. That's really, I think, Richard the Lionhearted and Saladin are probably the two most known rulers in the Crusades, at least as far as I'm aware. Those are the names that I've heard the most often as sort of the two major opponents of the Crusades.
Well, Richard the Lionhearted is most known as the hero in Robin Hood.
I thought he was the villain.
No, Richard the Lionhearted, who is deposed by his villain brother John.
That's
Who
right.
had the sheriff of Nottingham defiling the countryside, and Robin Hood was stealing from those rich people and giving to the poor. And at the
That's
very end, if you remember the Errol Flynn movie, they snuck in to the castle dressed as monks.
That's right.
He revealed himself, and it always strikes me. You can YouTube this scene where it says somebody says it's Richard, and then I don't know if it's the same voice or somebody else's voice says the Lionhearted. It sounds funny. Richard, the Lionhearted. It's somebody from Brooklyn or something.
That's
Anyway,
good.
so yeah, he's known from Robin Hood.
Yeah.
Because he was away at the Crusades,
Mhm.
and his evil brother took over the management as like the steward while he
That's
was gone. And then King Richard the Lionheart, he got according to that story, was captured and was supposed to be ransomed, but then his brother wasn't going to send the money. But then he somehow got free, and then he came and
That's right.
saved the day for Robin Hood at the end.
Yes. But regardless, the Third Crusade failed to retake Jerusalem, but did save other Christian holdings. So mixed bag, I guess, with that one. And then you had the Fourth Crusade in 1204 was subverted by intrigues among the Crusaders themselves, mainly the Normans, who were the first warriors to arrive and who placed one of their own on the imperial throne. So
We're
they showed
here.
up like
We're in
we're
charge.
taking in charge. Uh, yes, of course, there were arguments between them and the Venetians, who provided transportation in the Near East, and the Byzantines. And they were first diverted to conquer a city in the Balkans that had rebelled against Venetian dominance, and et cetera, et cetera. They took Constantinople, which is perhaps the largest and richest city in the world, and partly perhaps in retaliation for a massacre of Latin Christians some years before, brutally sacked it,
Yes.
desecrating churches and contemptuously placing a prostitute on the throne of the patriarch in the Hagia Sophia. So they really were not happy with the Easterners at that point in time. And then Pope Innocent III condemned this perversion at first, but then allowed it to stand, thereby creating an enduring grievance of the Eastern Church against the West. So like, hey, your Pope, supported and then putting a prostitute on this throne. It's like, I guess that's probably a good complaint to have. I can see where they're coming from. But he does mention that they had shared churches sometimes until well into the 14th century.
I thought this was wild.
Yeah, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, on the islands of Crete and Cyprus, where they allowed the Eastern Christians to retain their own observances, and sometimes they shared the same churches, each celebrating their own liturgy, which is something you see very much anymore, if at all.
Nope.
And then the Fifth Crusade, we keep doing these. There are a lot of them. There are 7. It was proclaimed by Innocent III in 1213, but it didn't begin for 4 years and had little effect. And this is when they decided that they had to go through Egypt first, and so they spent a lot of time trying to invade through Egypt and just to little avail. And then you have the Sixth Crusade, which Louis IX mounted in 1248, again pursuing the Egyptian crusade or the Egyptian strategy. Had some success, but he was captured, had to be ransomed. Happens to the best of us. But of course, later on, there was all kinds of efforts. Various Christian princes arrived in the Holy Land with really no lasting result. The last Christian outposts in Acre, Beirut, Haifa, and the biblical cities of Tyre and Sidon fell in 1291. And their survivors were ruthlessly persecuted. Occasional forays by European princes after that. The Seventh Crusade in 1365 attacked Egypt and sacked Alexandria before retreating. And that was really sort of the last of the Crusades. Ended with not really a whole lot of success for the Christians at all. Then we get into a section about efforts of reunion, unless you have anything else you want to say about the Crusades there.
No.
All right. Moving on to efforts at reunion. The Mongols were seen as a useful tool at one point in time because they were really threatening the Eastern Empire. They were threatening to invade Europe. Their empire stretched from China into Eastern Europe. They got as far west as the Adriatic Sea, but turned back voluntarily. It seemed for a time that Mongols and Christians in the Near East might ally against Islam, interestingly enough. So it's not that the East and the West were going to ally against the Mongols, is that they were all going to ally with the Mongols against Islam. Interesting.
Yeah, and the timeline, I didn't realize that when you talk about how they got as far as the Adriatic Sea, that was in 1265, and I always thought they were older. Just putting all these events in the same time frame is just fascinating to me.
Yeah. Because you really don't think of the Mongols existing in the same time frame as the Crusades.
Right.
You don't hear about Mongolian, Crusaders or anything like that.
Right.
I guess it's possible.
They should have.
Yeah, I guess. That's what the churches wanted.
Yep.
But you did have Catholic conversions, so every once in a while, emperors and patriarchs would, convert to Catholicism. He says in 1274, an Eastern delegation attended the Second Council of Lyons, when both Emperor Palaeologus and Patriarch John Vecos submitted to papal authority. But Pope Martin IV, who reigned from 1281 to 1285, antagonized Michael by supporting the claims of a French candidate to the imperial throne. And of course, things kind of fell apart after that. But Emperor John V, Palaeologus, came to Rome in 1369 and eventually became Catholic. So you do have stories of people wanting to return to the faith. And then you have the councils of Florence and Ferrara, when relations between East and the West became intertwined with the conciliar movement in the West. And a Greek delegation, desperate to solicit Western help against the Turks, and attended the Council of Basel in 1431. But then when Pope Eugene IV, who reigned from 1431 to 1447, summoned his own council at Ferrara in 1439, a delegation of 700, including Emperor John VIII Palaeologus. Keep all these people straight. There's going to be a quiz. There's a lot of names. And then Eugene announced a crusade, but with little effect. And even though they both attended these two councils, Florence and Ferrara, there really wasn't much opportunity for a sophisticated exchange between them. And Florence eventually proclaimed that only those in communion with the Roman Church could be saved. And on paper, it was a great success, as a number of Eastern prelates subscribed to its decrees, but in practice at a chief level. So on paper, there was this movement at these two councils, but nothing really came of it.
Right.
But they proclaim reunion anyway, and really kind of in tying into the effort to push back the Turks was the driving force between Byzantine ecumenism. And there was some genuine desire for reunion. In 1452, reunion was proclaimed in Hagia Sophia. But really, this didn't last. And the final rupture between Catholicism and Orthodoxy occurred in 1472, when the Orthodox formally repudiated the formulae agreed to by John VIII. So they eventually said, we don't agree with you. We're done. We're done with you guys, for the most part, to summarize.
Yep.
Then you have the fall of Constantinople, fell to the Turks in 1453, and brought an end to just about all of the Latin influence in the Near East, to the point where one Eastern bishop was reported to have said, with reference to the respective headdresses of Muslims and Christian and Catholic bishops, better a turban than a mitre. So when the Turks finally claimed Constantinople, really just severed any sort of Western influence from getting into the Eastern Church. But then you have the Ottoman threat, of course. There's always more threats. You're never really safe out there in the East. And he says,
they're really at the intersection of all of this ancient travel. It's like you get the Persians, you have the Muslims, everybody's going through that area, which made Constantinople so strategically important, but also made it vulnerable, because you have various powers that are going to be focusing on that area.
Mm-hmm. And so you have here in the early 1500s, Leo X tried to get the European monarchs to respond to this expansion of power of the Ottomans. But successive popes tried vainly to mount new crusades, and the Ottomans just kept pushing farther and farther, opposed only occasionally by Balkan princes and emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. But for a time, they were actually in alliance with the Catholic King Francis of France,
right?
In an alliance that dictated by the intense rivalry between France and the Holy Roman Empire. So you even have the factionalism there, even within the West.
Yeah, because he wanted them to come up on the other side
to
occupy them and wear them down and divide the spoils, so to speak.
Yeah, very true. We then get into this discussion of the Ottomans subduing Serbia, the Isle of Rhodes, and Hungary by the 1520s. So they're really advancing pretty close into Europe here, all the way up into Eastern Europe.
Yeah. I mean, they came very close to just sweeping through. And it was the king of, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, the king of Poland
Hmm.
is the one that really stopped him in the battle in Vienna in 1683. He came to Vienna's rescue.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for that battle, they would have swept through.
Hmm.
That's really a turning point in history. And if the Polish king, I think they had a cavalry charge, if I remember correctly,
Hmm.
that really saved the day. But
Yeah, that's true.
for the for the Catholics,
Hmm. And now here we come into this discussion as we're really getting more into the modern era up into the 1700s, where he's saying, after this big split in the Middle Ages, the Holy See showed, more and more willingness to make accommodations with Eastern Christians who were in
right,
communion with Rome. So not those that officially split, but these different rites, different sort of liturgies that existed out there. How do we deal with all this?
right,
Um, he says the official policy was enunciated by Pope Benedict XIV, who reigned from 1740 to 758, that declared that the Easterners had a right to retain their own customs. So, we can't just tell them, no, you have to do it this exact way, or you're not going to be good. We do have to let them sort of do their own thing. They've done it for, hundreds of years at this point.
right.
And so
If
several,
it's not a matter of theology,
yeah,
because what's the difference between leavened or unleavened bread? I mean, I don't know that there is a difference in the liturgy,
yeah.
just a tradition.
Mm-hmm. He says usually it was just the liturgy itself that defined these rites. There really wasn't any other difference. As he says, it was just, how you literally just celebrated the mass is the big difference here. He says most Eastern rites followed the ancient Eastern customs, married priests but not bishops, leavened bread in the Eucharist, communion in both kinds, and iconostasis separating the sanctuary, baptism by immersion, which is followed by chrismation, blessed sacrament reserved mainly for the sick, not for veneration, and standing during most of the Eucharist, and icons rather than statues as objects of devotion.
Yeah,
So the major principles of basically all these Eastern rites that are, sort of in union with Rome.
right.
Kind of skipping through a couple of these because we kind of already mentioned them in that section there. But he says, to get into to some of the specific rites here, because I thought this was really interesting, how some of these historically developed, getting into the Byzantine rite, which uses Old Church Slavonic, which was that language originally developed by Saint Cyril and Methodius. And he says the oldest communities that still use this rite are in Italy, where some of the monasteries of the south continue to use the Greek language after Rome adopted Latin and remained in communion with Rome after the Schism of 1054, which I thought was interesting. I didn't realize there was anywhere in Italy that retained Greek
Yeah,
after sort of the Latin was declared sort of the language of the church.
yeah,
And for a period in early modern times, the Byzantines were under Latin Rite bishops, but their hierarchy was eventually restored. It was their integrity that Benedict XIV sought to protect. Then we get to Ruthenians, who are closely related to the Russians ethnically, were a branch of the Byzantine Rite found mainly in Ukraine, Poland, Slovakia, Serbia, and Hungary. And many call themselves Ukrainians, the name Ruthenian being primarily an ecclesiastical title. He says it really began when the Archbishop Isidore of Kiev, who died in 1463, aroused the wrath of the Tsar by accepting the decrees of the Council of Florence and was forced to flee to Rome, where he was made a cardinal. So he said, no, I do agree with this council. We should become a part of the Catholic Church officially. We should stop, trying to fight them. And the Tsar was not happy about that. And so that led to a lot of Russian converts who still followed him when he was made an archbishop. And the Ruthenians under Polish rule continued in communion with Rome for a while, but a formal reunion occurred in 1595, which was a result of proselytization by the Jesuits, interestingly, who had a special mission to convert the Orthodox, which I never really knew that was their mission, was to convert the Orthodox.
yeah. I see there references to that throughout the rest of this chapter, where the Jesuits are trying to get them back into the fold, so to speak.
Yeah, that's true.
Now they just want to fly gay flags.
That sounds fair. They're trying to convert the Catholics. Let's see. We talk about Andrew Bobola, who died in 1657, was a Polish Jesuit who worked in Lithuania to convert the Orthodox. He was flayed alive by Cossack warriors. But there were some Russian converts after Catholic Poland came under Russian rule. Many of the leading Polish Ruthenians joined the Latin Rite, primarily just because of secular reasons, as Poland was partitioned among Catholic Austria, Protestant Prussia, and Orthodox Russia. So it's really just sort of where the boundaries lie, really kind of defined your faith at this time.
Right.
And he says the Russian government severely harassed the Ruthenians, surprise, surprise, culminating in their forced reunion with Orthodoxy. So this looks really sort of, 1800s, it appears to be, sort of the really sort of imperial period of Russia under the Tsars.
Correct.
But Russia officially granted religious freedom in 1905, and the Ruthenians were tolerated by the Austrians. But Russia conquered some of this Austrian territory and once again tried to return the Ruthenians to Orthodoxy. This was after World War One, when they reconquered this land.
Well, then we're pushing up against the creation of the Soviet Union too.
Yeah, that's true. And we have Andreas Szeptycki, or Szeptycki, perhaps, a very Polish name there. He says, Poland once again achieved independence after the war. There were sometimes violent clashes between Latin Rite Catholics and Ruthenians. The heroic St. Andreas Szeptycki, Metropolitan of Lvov, was put under house arrest by the Polish government. But due to his leadership, the Ruthenian Church recovered, was later deported to Russia, where he died in 1944, but helped to keep the Ruthenians alive at least a bit. And you have Joseph Slipsky, who died in 1984, so very, very up to the modern day. He was also imprisoned by the Soviets for many years. After World War II, the Soviet government again decreed the reunion of the Ruthenians with Orthodoxy, but few Ruthenians really submitted. And after the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, Catholic life began to revive, much of it stimulated by foreign clergy, of course. So good for them, reviving Catholic life after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Well, Pope John Paul was so instrumental in defeating the Soviet Union. Inspirational figure, and there are a lot of people that once the Berlin Wall fell, and there was an opening there, they went there to try to convert people.
Yeah, that's true. We then get into other rites here, sort of just listing some of these here. He says there was a Byzantine rite that was recognized by the Holy See in 1697 in Transylvania after Jesuits had reconciled some of the Orthodox to the Catholics. The Bulgarian Uniate Church was recognized in 1861, but its first bishop was, for political reasons, kidnapped and imprisoned by the Russians. Most of the laity returned to Orthodoxy. That's rough.
Whoops.
He says, interestingly, I like his point here, anomalously, until 1922, the French government, no matter how anti-clerical, which it definitely was the official protector of Near Eastern Catholics and occasionally intervened militarily for that purpose. And so why are the French doing this?
Just because they're an ally in that area. The French were opportunistic in foreign policy, still are.
He talks about the Melkites here in Egypt and Syria, which derive their name from the Syrian word for king. They continued to be under the authority of Constantinople and in time adopted the Byzantine liturgy and were part of the Schism of 1054. But some became Catholics during the Crusades, and the reigning patriarchs of Antioch accepted decrees of union of the Second Council of Lyons and the Council of Florence. So they've been around in communion with Rome for quite a while there. They're numerous in Syria and Palestine, but have suffered greatly during the various Near Eastern wars, and under the Patriarch of Antioch, who lives at Beirut in Lebanon and used the ancient Antiochian liturgy in Syrian and Arabic.
Yeah.
We also have the Maronites, which I've heard a lot about, who derive their name from a Syrian monastery that strongly opposed the Monophysites after Chalcedon.
Why have you heard a lot about them?
Because they are from Lebanon, right?
Yes.
I had two Lebanese people in my class at Our Ladies for many years, and they would talk a lot about the Maronites, very, very at length for some reason. They have a lot of family who were Maronites, and I think that they themselves were probably, raised Maronite in some capacity.
Yep.
Yes, they fled to Lebanon under a Muslim persecution, where there was considerable strife with the Melkites, but they were reconciled with Rome as a result of the Third Crusade. They're also headed by a prelate called the Patriarch of Antioch, and their liturgy is in Syriac and Arabic, with a number of Western modifications added over the centuries. Talks about Armenia, which embraced monophysitism in the early centuries, but there was a fragile reunion with Rome during the Crusades and a nominal acceptance of the decrees of Florence. But later missionary activity, especially by the Dominicans, had success. And he mentions here Catholics as well as Orthodox were victims of the anti-Armenian genocide perpetrated by the Turks during World War I.
Yeah, I think they pretty much just killed all Armenians, and
some
Catholics, somewhere there were other people. I mean, they really slaughtered a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, but somewhat miraculously,
even modern Turkey, like if it was a controversy, I think during Obama's term, about whether he would say that the Armenian genocide was a genocide.
Yeah,
he finally might have done that, and modern Turkish government was really PO'd about that.
Yeah.
But
he says that they do still exist, even though there was persecution that continued as parts of Armenia fell under the control of the Soviet Union. So they whichever ones, got out of the genocide were then under the Soviet Union, which was not very pro-Christianity, I guess you could say, or really pro-religion at all.
Anti-religion.
Yeah.
Their own religion, the religion of the state.
And you also have the Chaldeans, which was the church in Persian Mesopotamia, which supported Nestorianism after its condemnation, and for the next 1,000 years was the greatest missionary force in the world, establishing Christian outposts as far away as China. But this was really destroyed by the Mongols in the 14th century. And in the 16th century, a split in the Nestorian church led some to be reconciled with Rome. And of course, they have a lot of schisms that follow after that. But he says the Iran-Iraq Catholics are called Chaldeans after the ancient homeland of the patriarch Abraham, and they use the Syriac language. And their patriarch resides at Baghdad. But of course, they've essentially been distributed all over the world now, with all of the terrorist wars in the Middle East, especially in Iran and Iraq.
Yep.
You also have the Copts.
I also mentioned here that I don't think it was reported at the time. The Iraq War in 2003, the majority of the 1.4 million Christian Iraqis were reported to have fled in the face of that battle and the civil war and everything else that followed it. It's pretty. Oddly enough, the oppressive government that existed before we invaded Iraq had some protections for those religious minorities, under their thumb. But anyway, and then once you let loose everything, and just had anarchy, it became almost less safe for the man on the street, which you wouldn't think it would be. And sometimes having a tyrant is better than anarchy.
Yeah, that's fair. And we then talk about the Copts, who were Egyptian Christians, and they really refused to accept the decrees of Chalcedon, became the separate Coptic or Egyptian church that retained monophysite beliefs. And a small number of converts were made during the 19th century. And the Coptic liturgy derives from the ancient liturgy of Alexandria, which is an adaptation of the Byzantine, celebrated either in Coptic or Arabic. You also have Ethiopia, which remained firmly monophysite despite missionary efforts. And formal reconciliation with Rome was announced early in the 17th century, but attempts to impose the Latin Rite led to a reaction in which priests were martyred and all Catholics were expelled from the country. And later attempts at conversion still led to more martyrdoms. And he says the few Ethiopian Catholics also follow the Coptic liturgy. So,
I had no idea there was a historically Catholic community in Ethiopia. I had no idea.
Well, Ethiopia, I knew that for sure. They were the first country to officially adopt Christianity before any other country in the world.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
They had the first Christian king or emperor, I guess. I don't know what their legal system or their political structure was at the time. But then we talk about the St. Thomas Christians. He says, during the Middle Ages, the Holy See periodically sent legates to Christians in India who traced their ancestry to St. Thomas the Apostle and recognized the authority of a pope about whom they knew very little, because, of course, no very good communication with India at the time. And they were also seem to have been evangelized by Nestorian missionaries from Babylon and adapted the Chaldean liturgy. And interestingly, when the Portuguese arrived in India around 1500, the St. Thomas Christians recognized them as fellow Catholics. And so it's like, hey, we know you guys. We followed the same stuff, which is pretty wild. I mean, I don't know how you can't really imagine like going over this place, where you have such little contact, and it's like, oh, we follow the same faith. That's pretty crazy.
Right.
But at this point in time, they were temporarily without a bishop, probably because of Muslim persecution. And so they're placed by the Holy See under the Chaldean Patriarch of Baghdad. But the Portuguese were suspicious of the St. Thomas Christians, whom they considered Nestorians. They attempted to force a Latinized liturgy, but many of the St. Thomas Christians went into schism in 1653, and many subsequently returned to communion with Rome. And they were governed mainly by European bishops until the 20th century, when the Syro-Malabar hierarchy was restored. In 1930, the remaining Indian schismatics reconciled with Rome as the Syro-Malankara Rite, which uses the ancient Antiochian liturgy. And then just a brief mention of the Syro-Malabar Rite, which is the largest Eastern church after the Ukrainians, and 3 of the 10 largest orders of women in the church. Interesting. Yeah. Franciscan Clarist Congregation, Congregation of the Mother of God of Carmel, and the Sisters of the Adoration of the Blessed Sacrament are part of that rite. Is the Chaldean liturgy, including the Syriac language.
Good job.
All of the rites. Yes, had to take over there like halfway through, but that's all right.
I was having a hard time speaking English.
Yeah, I could tell. What did you think of that chapter?
I liked it. It was great. I mean, it just jumped around a little bit much, and there's a lot. It's hard to keep it all straight, but excellent read and fun to learn about.
Yeah, no, it was very interesting. I'm guessing we're not going to hear really too much about the Eastern Orthodox really throughout the rest of the book, because he kind of just took all of their history and summarized it in this one chapter, even up to the modern day. And I'm sure we'll get some mentions of them, but it seems like he kind of just wanted to discuss that now and then from
Yeah.
here on out, it's going to be focusing mostly on the Western Catholic Church.
Well, it's the history of the Catholic Church. It's not
Yeah,
the history of every other religion. So it
that's
makes
true. That's true. That does make sense. No, but I
Mhm.
thought this was a good chapter.
Yeah.
Um, Gave good summaries of all these little things and sort of working in, sort of a history of Islam there very briefly and how it
Yeah.
relates to the Eastern Orthodox, which I thought was interesting. Of course, that would have been very major influence on the Eastern Orthodox, probably more than it was on the Western Roman Catholics.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes.
They had to struggle with it
No, that's
directly.
true. Do you have
Mm,
any other thoughts about this chapter?
no.
All right. Well, this has been season 6, episode 10 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I've been Mark Bishop,
You
but
can, of
it's
course.
still Mark Bishop.
There you go. It's still Mark Bishop. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions.
Hey, we got to do something with that, like a T-shirt contest or
We
something.
do, yeah, for seasons 5 and 6.
With maybe the contest would be give me an idea to have on my radio show. Dual purpose it.
There you go. There you go. We should make a mug or something instead of a T-shirt.
Oh yeah, that's not a bad idea.
Do that. I think that's a good idea.
Other swag.
Yes, well, tweet at us ideas for this legal show, I guess, and we'll see what happens
Oh, I'm
there.
just joking.
I know. Well, we'll do something. We'll do something.